Then the one inside answers, "Don't bother me. The door is already locked. My children are with me in bed. I can't get up and give you anything. I tell you, though he will not get up and give him the bread because he is his friend, yet because of this man's boldness, he will get up and give him as much as he needs." This has been pretty much taught to me that I pretty much have to be really persistent with God to get my needs met. I have to pester him a lot. I have to cajole him to move his hand and pry these fingers open to get that bread that Jesus told me to have, to pray for daily. I don't think it says that anymore. But to begin to understand that this is not really a parable teaching persistence. It's not about begging God. We need to really understand three things. And here's what you need to know. First of all, in those days, there were no nonstop McDonald's. Yeah. I mean, it's in the margins. Did you catch it? It's the alternative the reading of the Greek. There were no nonstop McDonald's. And what I say that in a kid about it, just to put it, I want to highlight the cultural setting. By the way, there are so much more just driving up here than there used to be when I lived around, because I was always looking for McDonald's where I could at least understand the menu when I first got here, and mostly understand what's a quarter pounder, but there weren't conveniences like that where at any time and any day when you had someone come in, that you could go get a loaf of bread or some food to place before them if you didn't have it. And in the Oriental culture that Jesus lived in, that was a huge expectation. You see, this parable is an Oriental story revolving around this same Middle Eastern sense, Mid-Eastern sense of shame if you can't provide. If you had a guest come at any time, you needed to be able to place food and water in front of them and refresh them. And if you couldn't do it, your village or your community also had that obligation. It was an expectation. And so when this man had a guest show up in the middle of the night, it would really be unthinkable for him not to be able to set something before him. And that unthinkable, uncomfortable cultural setting was enough to move him to go out and wake up his neighbor and pound on the door. And that cultural setting was also enough, or that cultural expectation was also enough to move that man whose kids were laying in bed next to him, and basically meaning that he was going to arouse the family to get up and unlock the door. It would move him to unlock the door and give him as much bread as he needed, because the culture expected it. It was basically, and you see a marginal reading here for persistence, to avoid shame. To avoid shame. A guy named Alan Johnson has written about this, and it's really helped me. And most of what I'm saying, I've gotten on this section, I've gotten from him. I hope I can do justice, because it's a technical article that he wrote about it in. But he makes several points, and this is the first one. He says, the culture demanded that he be a good host. And it demanded that the neighbor be a good host as well. So it wasn't a matter of begging, it was a matter to avoid shame. The second thing to see here is this phrase he says, in the new NIV it says, suppose one of you has a friend. Well, that's really an expression, the wording there, the way it's constructed, according to Allen, I'm not that technical with Greek, he says the expression used here in the New Testament to introduce a rhetorical question. He's asking, suppose, and you always have friends who answer rhetorical questions in class. I had friends like that. But this is a rhetorical question that demands a negative reply, the way it's constructed. But not only is it just negative, it's indignantly negative. No! I can't imagine that. So basically what Alan Johnson says, he says instead of suppose one of you have a friend, he would say to Wright, can you imagine having a friend, and he goes to him at midnight and says, friend, leave me a loaf of bread, 3 loaves of bread, because this friend of mine on a journey has just come to me and I have nothing to set for him. And the answer is no, I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that the one inside would not answer and say, here's all you need. It's a cultural expectation, and it's reinforced by the nature of the rhetorical question that Luke writes here. And then it goes further. Allen goes further, and he says, and even the very word used for boldness basically had a shift in meaning from the first century to the middle centuries, and early on in the first century there wasn't evidence that it was used for this ideal of shamelessness, or of persistence or importunity. Rather, it seemed to take on a gradual shift to conform with the Catholic Church's teaching that basically we had to earn things. We had to prove ourselves, and there were some other reasons he gives, but basically he goes on and he says that this would really be best translated that this man would get, because of his desire to avoid shame, the sleeper would get up and give the neighbor as much bread as he needs, because he wants to avoid shame. He wants to avoid shame personally. He wants his neighbor to avoid shame. And that would drive him to answer the door and give him the bread. Now, to me, this fits in with the theme of a Heavenly Father who wants to provide for us much better than the concept of persistence, where you're prying something out of God's fingers to get it from Him. Because Jesus has just said, give us this day our daily bread. He wants to come, and He fits in, and He comes, and it flows with the parable, then flows with what his earlier, clearer teaching, is that God is like this. We don't have to be persistent to get our loaf of bread. His nature is at stake. He cares for us, and He wants to provide for our needs, and then go to Him. And then to reinforce that, He's going to go ahead and move into this next section. But I think this little parable teaches two crucial things. That we first have a faithful God. We have a God who will provide for His children, and it's His character. If the sleeper, the neighbor, the sleeper would get up and help to avoid shame, how much more will God move to meet the needs of His needy children? Because that's His character. He won't be shamed. And then the second thing that teaches me is that I'm a dependent child. I should go and ask. I can go and ask confidently because I have a Father who wants to meet my needs. We can be a confident and dependent child. I had a work situation years ago, but when we had our cell phones were through the ministry, we paid them, but we had a corporate contract. But every 2 years when we had to renew, we had to get papers signed by our operations director. Well, this guy, he's a great guy, but he had busy days, so every time you had to come in to do something like this, and he thought I bought cell phones too often anyway, because I was the gadget guru, and he'd go, he'd grimace and, you're bothering my day and stuff. And I thought, if that's what I transpose onto God sometimes, is that grimacing, you're bothering me viewpoint. Because that was the way my earthly father was a lot. Same facial expressions as my friend, my colleague, my father had. Every time I'd go to him to ask for something that was a little bit something that wasn't convenient. And I transpose that onto God. And I think Jesus is giving us this parable to basically say this. God is not like that. He wants His children. He likes His kids coming to Him for their needs. And that changes my whole approach on prayer. It's not that I'm not diligent in prayer, and there are some other things we're persistent for, but in this parable, the issue is the character of God and the dependency of His children. That's what God is like. He's a faithful Father, and we're His children. And just in case it's not clear enough, Jesus is going to make it a little clearer with these next promises. So I say to you, ask. It's a little poem almost. I say to you, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find, and knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks the door will be open. And I think he gives us this little section here, this little poetic thing, simply to bolster our confidence, to give us more confidence in going to the Father. You see, And even here, the Father, in case we don't get it yet, wants us to go to Him. In fact, Jesus commands it. Ask, seek, and knock. He doesn't say beg, grovel, and whine. He says ask, seek, and knock. And we can go with him, to Him based on this, even, with a certain expectancy. Somebody's having fun. How many of you, has anyone not heard of Charles Spurgeon? Probably the greatest English preacher our England ever had. Charles Spurgeon he pastored the Baptist Tabernacle, a great church in London in the 1800s. Thousands attended his services. They were converted and discipled. He's still known as the Prince of Preachers. Billy Graham is maybe as close. He's widely acknowledged today as one of the greatest English-speaking preachers of all time. And two Americans were visiting his church, and this is how the story goes. They arrived early on one Sunday morning to tour the church. And they asked an individual who introduced himself as a member of the church if he'd take them around and give them a little bit of a tour. And the man invited them first to come down and look at the furnace room. And they were like, probably I were, they were taken aback and thought, well, maybe this is just a strange British custom. Or would that be Great British custom or United Kingdom custom? I don't know. And so they didn't want to be impolite, so they agreed. And this man led them down the stairs into the sub-basement, down to the basement to the sub-basement, and he threw open a huge door and showed them the furnace room. And as the door swung open, they were greeted by an astonishing sight. Among the huge boilers were 200 people on their knees in prayer. And the guide laughs, and he looks at him, and the Americans who were still quite mystified by this whole thing, and he said, well, I've had my little joke. I'm Charles Spurgeon, the pastor of this church. And many people give me the credit for what has happened in this church. But the truth is that these people pray here for an hour before each service and well into the service itself. The power and ministry I have in the pulpit is proportional to the fire of prayer here in the furnace room. This is the secret of my ministry. And that's why Jesus says, ask, seek, and knock. Not only is it the secret of a ministry, it's the secret of our life. This is where the power of God specifically can enter into our lives. Now, personally, I don't think prayer has any power. Because prayer is simply talking with God. God has power, but He seems to release it as we ask. And that's why Jesus says, ask, seek, knock. And we can ask urgently, we can ask repetitively, and we can ask with much passion. It doesn't discount what Jesus has already said, but remember, it's our Father that we're asking. If we need guidance, He's glad to give it. His time, His way. If we need help, He gives it. He wants to meet our needs. And then Jesus finishes His teaching on prayer with the disciples with the last little piece. And it's really just, I think, perspective. Verses 11 through 13 have really helped me as well. Because He gives here the perspective of a wise and protective Father. Because as I read, especially 9 through 10, ask, seek, and knock, it seems like the language is too limitless. And as I read in John 14, the language is limitless for prayer. And I almost want Jesus to put, I think Jesus needs to put a disclaimer on it. Just, kind of like, what's that word you were telling me? In the advertisements in Germany, they show something and ohne Inhalt, you don't get the contents or, whatever. That he needs to put a disclaimer on his teaching on prayer just because, so we don't overdo it. So we don't ask for something we shouldn't. But I don't see Jesus doing that. He's using this language that is very expansive, very huge. And he doesn't seem to throw limitations on conditions. Now, there are some conditions given to us in the epistles. James writes that you don't get your prayers answered because you have wrong motives. And Peter writes that many men don't get their prayers answered because they're inconsiderate behavior towards their wife. That's 1 Peter 3:7. So You might want to mark that down. Your wife has already underlined it in your Bible.